Welcome to the series What Jesus Meant. Hello, I'm happy to introduce you to the series of biblical messages by Dr. Balsan Thampu titled What Jesus Meant. As the title suggests, here's an attempt to unveil the deeper dimensions of Jesus' teachings. But being a Christian is not a requirement for viewing them. Jesus is presented here as the light of the world and not as the icon of a religion. Balsan is a voice heard with attention as a teacher, thinker, author, and preacher in Christian and secular contexts in India for over 4 decades. He teaches as one excited about the contemporary relevance of Jesus' spiritual vision. Through these video messages, he offers the fragrance of a fresh understanding of what it means to be Christian. This is a study series without academic rigors. For best results, viewers need to pursue the trail of thought to the end as a learning and unlearning experience. We hope you enjoy.
A warm welcome to everyone to the series of messages centered on the teachings of Jesus Christ, titled What Jesus Meant. Our focus today is on a central theme stated or implied in the Gospel of John, chapter 3, verse 16. God so loved the world that he gave his only Son, that whosoever ever believes in him should not perish, but have everlasting life. Put very simply, the heart of this verse is that Jesus is the embodiment of God's love for the whole world. But it is a fact that Christendom as a whole, though it quotes this passage with great spiritual fervor, overlooks the larger dimensions or larger scope of these words. What does it mean to acknowledge Jesus as God's love for the whole world? And there is a reason for it, and that reason needs to be understood. The important thing for us to remember is that every human being is ridden by his or herself. Something that all thinkers in the world have agreed without any difference is that in this world, everyone acts only for his or her own sake. Disinterested activities are theory rather than practice. And therefore, to understand some of these things, we have to really look at how our human nature works or how the self works. And this question is very central to the teachings of Jesus Christ. For example, he said that anyone who would come after him must deny himself. So Jesus recognized that the self in this state is a real spiritual hindrance. So that is what we are going to do at the moment. Why is it that the self interferes with our understanding of the larger horizons of this revelation, this profound spiritual insight that Jesus is the embodiment of God's love for the whole world? Now we are quite happy to accept that God loves us. But should God love the whole world? That's rather problematic. Why is this so? And it needs to be understood. Perhaps I can offer 2 reasons why we find it difficult to understand texts of this kind. This is not the only text. Similar texts are not understood adequately because their larger implications cannot be fitted into the frameworks that we create for ourselves. So the first thing I want to point out is that the self seeks only what is its own convenience. The self cannot go beyond itself, and therefore the interests of the self tends to narrow and limit our understanding of the scope of God's love. Now, To put it differently, it is innate in the self to crave to be privileged. That's as crisply and simply I can put it. The self craves to feel privileged. Now, for the self to feel privileged, it is necessary that others are made underprivileged, psychologically speaking. The sense of privilege rests on the perception of underprivilege for others. How can I feel privileged if others are not underprivileged? So we use God as a marker of our sense of privilege, as well as a marker of underprivilege for others. And that being the case, it's very difficult for us, and it is understandable that it is difficult for us that God can love the whole world. But if God loves the whole world, what happens to our sense of special privilege? So this is a problem. This is a real problem. And this is something we don't articulate. That's the reason why I have to state it. And I pray that we come to grips with this, because we can't make any spiritual progress. Particularly, we can't make any progress in understanding the true meaning, the spirit of Jesus' teaching, if this is not understood. The second point I want to make, which is related to this, is that the self is ridden with a taboo against knowing. This may surprise you, but that is a fact. All of us harbor within ourselves a reluctance, an aversion, a hesitation, indeed fear about knowing. Knowing what is beyond our little world, this tiny world, the cocoon that we have created for ourselves. That is what I refer to as the taboo against knowing. Because if we know these larger truths, how will we practice it? How will we live with it? So, because of these two factors, the wider implications in the teachings of Jesus Christ are rarely understood by us. And that's the reason why this series has been conceived. And I am happy to offer it out of love for all of you. So now let's focus on this. Jesus is God's love, or the embodiment or incarnation of God's love for the whole world. And therefore, we need to understand love one way or another. And I'm going to offer two very simple, absolutely simple categories or categorizations. I'm going to categorize two loves. In the first instance, we have self-love. In self-love, one loves only oneself. Self-love may love others, but that's only for one's own sake. And the moment the self perceives that loving somebody else is not conducive to its own profit or convenience or advantage in some form or the other, the self will withdraw from it. Such love is temporary, fleeting. In contrast to this, as Paul says in the first letter to Corinthians, chapter 13, verse 8, love never fails. Selfish love fails. It's bound to fail. There's no surprise at all that selfish love fails. It has to fail. It's in its nature to fail. But there is a love that does not fail, and that's a love we denote as God's love. Now, God is the fountain spring of love. It's from God that we learn to love at all. It's not natural to human beings to cultivate this kind of, or to sort of evolve this kind of love out of themselves. And we need to abide in God to learn love of this kind and to acquire the strength, the capacity to practice love of this kind, love of the selfless kind. And therefore, the very purpose in God intervening in the human condition, which is marked by the famine of lovelessness throughout the world, is to kindle in us a capacity to love. And it is love of this kind that Jesus Christ embodies for the whole world. Now, let's now clearly recognize the difference between these two kinds of love. In self love, it is the self that drives all human relationships and interactions, presumably based on love. And therefore, as I said, whatever is not in the interest of the self will immediately scuttle this love relationship and bring it to a close. And that's the problem with self love or self centered love. As far as godly love is concerned, God is its driving force. God does not change, God does not fail, and therefore love does not fail. And therefore, St. Paul is absolutely right when he says, love does not fail. Please understand, Paul is not referring to the kind of love that's found in the world, which is self-love, which is camouflaged in all kinds of ways, but at the end of the day, you will know that it is pure self-love. That love will fail, no question about it. So, the love that Jesus embodied for the whole world will not and cannot fail, and it will not fail even on the cross. It needs to be emphasized that one tremendous message from the cross of Calvary is that love never fails. Even when Jesus was suffering unimaginable anguish, excruciating physical pain, his love for humanity never ended. After all, the very first thing he said on the cross is, Father, forgive, for they know not. That prayer can come only from a heart of pure love. It's unimaginable otherwise. So, one important message from the cross of Calvary is that God's love for humanity never fails. Now, this, of course, must also challenge us to think of the bankruptcy in which we live in this world. It has two aspects. One is that we are not loved. Ask any human being you meet today, tomorrow. Any human being. Ask the question, are you loved? She would say, no, I'm not. I wish I were. Then ask the same person a question. Do you have the capacity to love? Or even, do you have the capacity to be loved? You see, I'm told that these days young people do not want to be loved by their parents, for example. They consider parental love some kind of an interference. So this question of love is not all that simple. So people are not loved. Or let me put it this way. I am not loved. And I do not want to love because I have not developed the capacity to love. So I am not loved, I don't love. And everybody is like me. So therefore, everybody is in the state of not being loved as well as the incapacity to love. Therefore, does it surprise us that this world is a world in which there is a famine of love? And this is the universal human predicament. Institutionalized lovelessness. There are historical, psychological, anthropological, theological reasons for it. I will not get into that because that will take me quite off the track in relation to the central purpose. So, let me put it down. In the light of what we have seen so far, it's quite clear that God intervenes in the human predicament, in the human condition of this incapacity, this deep-rooted incapacity to love, in order to kindle in human nature the capacity to love. The greatest service that can be done to humankind is to kindle in the human species, the seed of the human species, a capacity to love. And that's what I mean by healing humankind. We often think of individuals being healed of this particular disease or that particular disease. That's a small thing compared to this. Jesus came not to heal people of their individual illnesses. Yes, he did that. But if you consider all of that and look a little beyond individuals to the larger resonances of the healing ministry that Jesus exercised, you will immediately see that all of that pointed to one thing, and that is humanity itself needs to be healed. And that is the quintessential spiritual agenda. That is God's agenda. And therefore, I make bold to say that the shaping purposes of God's intervention in the human condition is to kindle in us, to awaken in the humankind the capacity to love, because a fundamental human illness is the incapacity to love, and even the incapacity to be loved. You want a proof of this? Well, Jesus is God's love for the whole world. So what did we do to him? Caught him and crucified him. That is the measure of our incapacity, not only to love, but even to be loved. Jesus came to love us, therefore we killed him. So that is the issue. It's a very serious issue that we are addressing, and therefore I hope and pray that we would be able to understand progressively the gravity of this theme as well as its many ramifications. The only way humanity can be helped, the only way, is by restoring to human nature the capacity to love. If humankind is equipped in loving, as love is understood spiritually, this world will be heaven. Now this world looks more like hell, a living hell, because, as I said, because of our deep-rooted, institutionalized incapacity for love. And it is this harsh reality that God, out of his love, addresses through the intervention of Jesus Christ. So, the mission of Jesus Christ is to make love an integral part of the substance of humanity. Now, let's consider for a very brief while the religious aspect of our selfish incapacity for love. Or to put it more positively, let's consider from a religious angle what this human capacity for spiritual love really means. Now, this would suddenly confront us with a shocking truth. And that truth is, contrary to our assumptions, our facile assumptions, the reality is that we can't tolerate God as love. And I'm going to stop a little while that this may sink into us. We cannot tolerate God as love. Contrary to what we profess, contrary to what we assume, contrary to what we mouth from day to day, the real truth, the heart of the matter, is that we cannot tolerate God as love. Why? Because imagine God loving non-Christians as he loves us. Because if Jesus says you must love your neighbor as yourself, and that is godly love, and God has that kind of love, God will love not only us but also non-Christians. Then what happens to us? Very unpleasant. We feel suddenly underprivileged. Okay, that's bad enough. But that's not the end of the story. God loves our enemies. And that's a bit too much, right? That's taking things too far. That's why Jesus said, love your enemies and pray for those who revile and persecute you. For what spiritual profit it is for you that you love those who love you? In other words, the very purpose of love is to exemplify the nature of God to others, to the world, which is alienated from that love. And therefore, if you love only as the world loves, in what sense are you a Christian? In what sense are you a disciple of Jesus Christ? That is the meaning of that teaching. So let's fix this one thing in our minds, though it is very unpleasant to carry it. That is, we cannot tolerate the God of love. For example, we would like God to destroy our enemies. Let me be very, very frank with you. I've gone through innumerable grim struggles in my life. And oftentimes I got the feeling that I am being persecuted for doing what is right. And I have to make a clean confession to you that in such context, I said, like the psalmist points out this fact, why is it that my enemies flourish? Why can't God take it out on my enemies? I can't, because I don't have the strength. If I had the physical strength, I would have done it. So since I don't have the means to deal with it, God, why don't you? We really don't like God to like those we dislike. Now, in contrast to this thing of Jesus, who is actually the benchmark of selfless love, and the operating feature, the operating hallmark, the operating identification mark of the selfless love is that Jesus did not accept any walls, limitations, boundaries. And that's why St. Paul says that Jesus came to dismantle the walls of division. That's because Jesus is love. It's love that wants to cross man-made boundaries and embrace, if possible, the whole world. So, the main expertise of the self is in building walls. And that's what we do all the time. And I'm saying these things out of my struggle to understand myself. And in retrospect, I realized with a bit of a shock, or much of a shock really, that I've been building walls all the time. Walls of exclusion. So, as against building walls, which is human nature, what we find is exactly the opposite. Jesus came to dismantle these walls. Jesus is busy dismantling the walls that we are busy building. Now, that's not a happy state, is it? But we have not learned the truth in 2000 years. We still build, and we are going on building walls, and much of our resources, time and energy are invested in building higher and thicker walls. Sometimes this could even be the walls of our churches, denominational walls. Now, look at the way this love operated through Jesus Christ. There was a huge dividing wall in the Jewish community that excluded lepers, the victims of leprosy. Jesus broke that wall. Why? Because he is love. There was another wall that excluded tax collectors. They were considered stooges of the forces of domination, the Roman Empire. Jesus broke that wall. There is another wall, a thicker wall, a higher wall that excluded Samaritans. Jesus dismantled that wall. So on and so forth. Jesus even dismantled the wall that separated the Sabbath day from the weekdays. This is something that Christians don't understand even today, after 2000 years. Jesus dismantled every wall. Why? Because he is love. So, instead of building wall, what did he do? He not only dismantled this wall, but went a step further and invited everyone. We are very familiar with that verse in the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 11, verse 28. Come to me, all ye that labor and are heavy laden, and I will give you rest. All. And since we don't pause and reflect on these teachings, we do not feel offended. The fact is that there is an offense. We don't like everyone to be invited. As I said, it will conflict with our sense of privilege that is derived from excluding other people. That's the reason why we contemplate with some degree of furtive happiness that thousands and thousands, in fact a vast majority of people will be excluded from the comfort and privilege of heaven. So, the innate nature of love is to break walls of division and separation. And it is also the innate logic of human nature to build these walls. So we not only build walls here, we even build walls in heaven, life beyond death. I don't know how we will take the material from here to build walls there, but we will do that. For us, the idea that we will go to heaven and others will rot and perish in hell is a rather pleasant prospect. All right. Now, there's a clinching proof, if proof is required, that Jesus is indeed the embodiment of God's love. And this is actually mind-boggling. And that is, Jesus loved Judas to the end. Don't you think that Jesus knew that Judas was of this kind and that he was a betrayer? He knew from the beginning. After all, from the beginning, Jesus knew everything about his crucifixion. The crucifixion existed in the mind or in the awareness of Jesus long before it actually happened, every detail of it. So even when Judas volunteered to be Jesus' disciple, Jesus accepted him in full recognition of the fact that he was of that kind. Not only that what was prophesied may happen, but also, and this is most important, also that Jesus knew that even though Judas was a betrayer, he still needed to be loved. He needed love. And it is in the nature of love to extend that love even to a person like Judas. That's the ultimate test. Jesus does not exclude anyone from the purview, from the ambit of his love. That's why John is absolutely right in saying that Jesus is God's embodiment of love for the whole world. So Judas needed to be loved and accepted, even if he was the one to betray Jesus and sell him for 30 pieces of silver. So spiritually, the foremost question is not if I am loved or not, but if others have the need to be loved. But then if I am absorbed in the self, such a question will never arise. And when we consider the question if others need love, then the further question will arise, how will they be loved? Who will love them? Then the realization would dawn on us that if they are to be loved at all, then maybe I have to love them. Well, if I have to love them, then I have to grow into the discipline of loving and gain the strength, the awesome strength it takes to love like Jesus. To love those who can't love, but those who need to be loved all the same. And that is the awesome, absolutely awesome aspect of Jesus as God's love. So, the spiritual question needs to be kept in mind. You remember that interaction between Jesus and the expert in Jewish law who wanted to know who is my neighbor. And through that parable, the parable of the Good Samaritan, Jesus leads him to a very, very relevant insight. And that is, the question is not who is my neighbor. The question is if I have the capacity to be a neighbor to others. That's the question. So, and that is really the heart of the matter. Now, therefore, in the light of what we have encountered or explored so far, it is absolutely clear that the very first principle in experiencing this awakening or kindling of love within us is the principle of self-denial. And now the teaching of Jesus Christ as found in the 24th verse of the 16th chapter of Matthew's Gospel makes sense. Jesus says, if anyone would come after me, he must deny himself, take up the cross and follow me. Deny. Because if we don't deny ourselves, we will never love. When we will love only ourselves. And if we think we love others, it's only for our own sake that we love others, which is not love at all. It is something that passes for love, but it is not. Now, how important this theme is clearly demonstrated or illustrated through the life of Jesus. For example, one aspect of his life or one phase of his life that fascinates all of us, about which there is very little direct information, is Jesus' experience in the wilderness, where he went to fast and pray 40 days and 40 nights. Why did he do that? Why did he go there? What was he seeking to achieve? I think Jesus was perfecting the art of self-denial, because that's the starting point without which you can't go any further. So, the wilderness experience of Jesus. Wilderness is really a very powerful, resonant metaphor for the harsh struggle we need to undertake or undergo in mastering the self, in denying the self, in the true sense of the term. But it is not that we once experienced this great relief of mastering the self, but that the struggle against the self must continue till the last breath of our life upon the earth. Because self is such a tricky thing. We have to remain vigilant against its many games and tricks. So that's why spiritual vigilance against oneself is absolutely essential. And this is the kind of spiritual war that we are to wage. Now, I know Paul talks about the spiritual war in terms of corruption in heavenly places or high places, etc. But in my humble opinion, that is nothing compared to the war that we need to wage in the inner sanctuary of our life against our own selfishness, because that's the hardest, most and trickiest enemy to conquer. So, I believe in the holy war, and my understanding of holy war is this: the war that I wage against myself, and that war can only be fought within myself. And it's a war that I'm fighting even today, and I'm sure I'll have to continue to fight for as long as I'm here. So, this self-denial, which Jesus Christ, the need for which Jesus Christ understands, because he is the embodiment of God's love on earth. Otherwise, there is no need for it. Absolutely. So if you want to practice only self-love, it is foolish to try and deny the self. It's as simple as that. So, it's only because Jesus is the embodiment of God's love for the whole world that he needs to deny himself and this great wilderness experience, which for good reasons is not described in detail, because such things are left rather to the imagination of the soul. So, it is through this perfect self-denial that Jesus attains this oneness with God, God as a fountain spring of love. And that's why Jesus says with tremendous confidence, without the shadow of a doubt, as you find in the 30th verse of the 10th chapter of John's Gospel, I and my Father are one. Now, such a statement is possible only if there is a state of oneness we call mystical oneness with God. And Jesus attained that mystical oneness with God, and that happened, I believe, in the tremendous struggle with his own self or against his own self in the wilderness experience. So, love rooted in this state of absolute oneness with God can never fail. For God is immortal, God is eternal, God cannot fail. If God is love, we are rooted in God, and our love is of that kind that can never fail. Yes, love rooted in the eternal will never fail. But love rooted in the self will and must fail for the good reason that there is no point of stability in the self. The self is in a state of perpetual flux. It has no point of durability. The self doesn't stay the same even within a short span of time. Without our knowing it, the self in all its aspects continues to change. For example, science tells us that the human body changes almost entirely within 7 years. In the same manner, even human consciousness changes. For example, the consciousness we had 30 years ago is not the consciousness that we have about ourselves or the world today. So, no matter which aspect of the self you look at, you cannot but come to the conclusion that there is no point of stability about the self. Therefore, it makes logical sense that what is rooted in the self, which is changing continually, like the river that flows, cannot endure. Whereas what is rooted in God, who doesn't change, as the Bible says, Jesus is the same yesterday, today, and forever. That which is rooted in the unchanging cannot fail, so it makes good sense. So if anyone thinks that he is sufficient when put to the test in the battle of life and of love, he is grossly mistaken. We have a brilliant and dramatic illustration of this fundamental principle in the story of Jesus' suffering, and there is none other than Peter, the foremost disciple. When Jesus forewarns Peter that he would be put to the test and found wanting, Peter emphatically states, he says, even if the whole world falls away from you, I will not. That's when, out of great compassion, Jesus tells Peter, tonight before the cock crows 3 times, you will deny me 3 times, Peter, because human love rooted in the self, is brittle. It cannot stand the test of adversity. Very often we underestimate the twists and turns of life. We assume this posture of self-sufficiency because we've not really faced the storms, the upheavals of life, or felt the sting of life. And we also overestimate the capacities of the self. Our perception of ourselves in times of prosperity, times of peace, times of comfort, times of easy life can be grossly fallacious, wrong. And that's why periods of privation must come in order to bring us back to the world of realities. So one thing is absolutely clear, the self is not sufficient unto itself. But the good news is that the self does not have to be by itself. The self can be rooted in God and therefore be compensated for all its inadequacies. Now, in order to understand why the self is inadequate in this test of love, let's consider an example. Think of a young man who falls in love with a young lady because in his eyes she is beautiful, or she is distinguished, or she comes from a rich and reputed family, or whatever. Notice that all these considerations of the self are extraneous considerations. Extraneous to the truth of love, because love is an internal state which is not merely sentimental, an internal state that needs to be expressed through concrete action in the world. If love is only an internal state and it has nothing to do with the logic and the struggle of life outside, then this problem is not as acute as it really is. Now, suppose one day this beautiful girl gets involved in an accident and she is badly mauled in her face. The beauty on which the young man rested his love for her doesn't exist anymore. Then what happens to his love for her? He finds it very hard to come to terms with this reality. He will struggle against the realization that he doesn't love her anymore for some time, but in due course, he abandons himself to this realization. Sadly, that he cannot love her anymore. So it's very clear that love as a mere sentiment of the self is rooted in the most unstable considerations we can imagine. There is no control that we can exercise over the external circumstances of life. And when circumstances change, love also withers away. The love that is rooted in God is quite different from all this. The love that Jesus Christ manifested for humanity is the love that faced the brutal tests of the world and proved itself as authentic beyond our imagination. And that's the reason why the road to Calvary is considered not only by Christians but also non-Christians as the ultimate path of love. Greater love than this we can't imagine, that it withstands the test of death, even death on the cross. So, we will continue our reflections on Jesus as the expression of God's love for the whole world, for the reason that perhaps there is no other theme more basic, more central, more defining in its character in relation to the spiritual vision of the Bible, the spiritual vision that underlies Jesus' mission upon this earth. And we hope to explore further the relevance of this to the human condition in the coming 2 or 3 sessions as well. I thank everyone for participating in this journey of encountering the truth of Jesus' profound teachings, the relevance of which continues to increase in relation to the human predicament in this world. Thank you. See you soon.